Welcome back. You're still watching Morning Live. Now, let's get into this now before we get into our sports news about the latest happening in Russia, where we heard earlier that rebellious Russian mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin said he had taken control of the Russian city of Rostov-On-Don. But we know that the Wagner Group storms the headquarters of the Russian Defense Ministry. For more on this, let's speak to our international news editor, Sophie Mukwena. Ms. Sophie, good morning. Welcome to Morning Live. Unpack the events of this morning for us. What are we looking at the moment?
Good morning, Lebu and the viewers. You know that there has been this simmering tension between the formal military of Russia and this group, the Wagner. And they have been expressing their displeasure in terms of how they have been treated by the senior military personnel and the chief. And therefore, it was no surprise yesterday when we heard that they have decided to occupy certain strategic areas or positions or places in Russia. And clearly, the first place was going to be Parliament in Moscow, the Duma. But unfortunately, they didn't manage because there was a quick move by government of Russia, the military, deploying strong security around strategic key buildings. And also in St. Petersburg, which is another strategic city, where we saw President Putin meeting with African heads of state who went to Ukraine and St. Petersburg with the mission of bringing peace last week. And therefore, the other strategic area was to ensure that you protect the military base of the biggest one of Russia. But when you look at a city called Rostov, this is where they are kind of being in control, this semi-military or perhaps the military wing of Russia. We know that they are also operating. For me, my main concern is that they are also operating in West Africa. You know that with Russia trying to expand on the continent, you have this group in different parts of Africa where there has been military coups, including the current situation in Sudan. You have some of them in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and also where we had coups on the continent. Now, the question is, those who are deployed in Africa, how are they going to respond to what is happening in Russia? But secondly, President Putin has just addressed the nation about this issue. And it is the first time he's really addressing the nation, looking at what's happening within the military and looking at this group. Because often it's just your chief of the military and the generals who are talking to this group since this simmering tension started. And he pointed out that this is treason, and therefore Russia will not wait for eventuality. Two, he says this is mutiny, and therefore they will take action and they will defend Russia. He didn't mention the leader of this group, because the leader of this group is someone who was very, very close to the military, the headquarters in Russia and Moscow. And therefore, I think he is still going to try and speak to this guy, because yesterday the chief or the generals called on this leader of this group to be arrested and be charged. But they expected the very same group to arrest him, and they didn't. And therefore, it is for that reason this morning, for the first time, President Putin had to address this issue of the Wagner.
Is it alarmist to say that this is the biggest domestic crisis faced by the country?
That's how he put it this morning. He said this is the biggest challenge since 1917, during the First World War, when a group broke ranks or rebelled against Moscow. And therefore, he is saying that, and at that time it was Soviet Union. And he said this is the second incident. It happened during the First World War. You know, First World War ended in 1918. And now it's happening at the time. That's how he's characterizing this problem, where Russia is facing external forces. You know that he is fighting with Ukraine. And that war has now been classified as a proxy war, where Russia is fighting with the US and the West, because they are part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the military alliance NATO. And therefore, he sees this as something that's similar to that. And now the question, I think, in his mind, as a person with strong military intelligence, he might even suspect that there's infiltration of the external forces, because if he's comparing this to 1917, it means he is suspecting that it's a bigger issue that is also linked to what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, and of course starting to suspect the Western powers, the NATO group, perhaps having infiltrated this group. But we know that they have been complaining for quite a long time. And as I pointed out, the problem with these kinds of instability anywhere in the world, you can't say your region, your continent is immune. And as I pointed out, you have these members of these groups in areas in West Africa, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, where there were coups who supported the current interim military government that we see in West Africa, where there were coups. So the problem is not far from us.
Mm. And speaking of him, and he has 25,000 fighters, is that a realistic number of the people that are grieved?
It might not be the entire group, but it might be a portion. And when you are engaged in a war, I mean, Russia is engaged in a war, not internal conflict, a war with a neighbor, and a war where you have super or powerful nations having taken sides. And as I pointed out, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the military alliance, which the US is part of, they are supporting Ukraine. And you are facing a powerful force, then you have this rebellion in your own country, it becomes a problem, because you don't know, even the military itself, whether there are people who are not saying much, but who are not happy. We know that it doesn't mean the entire Russia supports President Putin. When you look at elections, when there's elections in Russia, he does win the election, but you also have the opposition, strong opposition. But currently, during this war, they were so quiet, and there was not much reported about the voice of the opposition. So you can't afford to have a rebellion in your own country when you are engaged in a war outside your country, because that will allow infiltration. And Putin, being the best former Gestapo member, knows this very, very well.
All right, Ms. Sophie Mukwena, thank you so much for talking to us, helping us unpack the latest of what is going on in Russia.